Great. So I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you all for coming out tonight. My name is Dr. Robert Shimp. I'm the director for the Lakewood Historical Society. I had no idea what to expect tonight, so this is quite the turnout here. Very, very impressive. Certainly like to thank Greg for the invite. I think he invited me about the first week after I started here, about a year and a half ago, so it's been on the books for a while. He got me straight away. And of course, Father Vincent for hosting tonight. This is really incredible to be here. It's an honor to be here, and hopefully in a small way help to commemorate this 150th anniversary for the Church of the Ascension. Really incredible run too, and to think about all of the, which we'll talk a little bit about as we go through here, the generations, the families, and the history connected to Lakewood is, it really is an honor, and I think it's really meaningful for us as a historical society to be able to participate in this, and certainly we have more events coming up throughout the summer that we'll be connected to, so we're thrilled to be a part of this moment. With that said, when I say adding a bit to the history here, I do mean just a bit to the history, because I do think you have one of the best, honestly, and most passionate, community historians that I've ever seen too, in Greg Shimp. He's going to fill in some of the maybe major gaps that I have here at the end, so we'll try to get full coverage as we go through. But of course, the church itself really is an anchor institution for the city of Lakewood, and of course Rockport Township before it. And we will talk probably more about Rockport Township and that periodization as we go through tonight. The church itself is really borne witness to some profound changes over time, not just in Rockport and Lakewood, but certainly the community, the nation, and the world at large. And I think still today really represents some of the core values of what Lakewood is, which is also doubly impressive, I think, for the work that the church does today. So what I'm going to do tonight is share first somewhat of an overview of Ascension's history, focusing kind of on that earlier period in time, then look at some of, again, not exhaustive, but some of the notable families. I think several of these names might be familiar. Some of the history you might know a good deal about. Some of these names might be surprising that you might just know from a street going through Lakewood. And then what I'd like to do too is situate the church in Rockport Township's religious history, which of course is very deep and wide too, while also looking at that moment in 1875 that Church of the Ascension came to be, and put it in context for what was going on in the nation and some trends there. I think it really is somewhat poignant that the church came to be in 1875, which I'll talk a little bit about at the end, kind of at this moment, the centennial moment for the United States as the nation was kind of reckoning with its history and what it was going to be coming out of the Civil War. So that was 1875 for the church's founding. And then at the dedication ceremony for this physical church that we're in tonight, that came right before Armistice Day that ended World War I. So it's kind of a fitting touchstone, I think, for that start and then for the dedication for this church. But to begin here, I'd like to add some perspective to the church's, again, remarkable run here in Rockport Township and Lakewood. Township was officially founded in 1819, and for the early period of the church, it was indeed, again, situated in Rockport, not Lakewood. Lakewood wouldn't come to play until 1889. Full name being Township 7, Range 14, 21 full sections, each 1 square mile, 4 partial sections. Of course, Native Americans had lived on the land and left an imprint in pathways and roads long before American settlers came from the east. And while a good number came to Rockport initially, very few remained in the first decades of the 19th century. By the time of Ascension's founding in 1875, though, Rockport was far more developed, though, of course, far from its peak in terms of housing and population in the 19-teens and 20s. 1875, Rockport by then had, of course, railroad coming through. Agriculture was still prime, and mansions had begun to crop up before the waves of new builds would come a few decades later. For the church itself, again, Ascension's played a central role since its founding in 1875. This early depiction here, and many notable, even some of those first families of Lakewood, Rockport Township have worshipped under its roof. The seeds were first planted by Reverend Lewis Burton, who was known as the Apostle of the West Side. Ascension started as a mission location for Trinity Chapel in Cleveland, and what was then still branching out. It was considered, again, a mission branching out into the rural side of the Cuyahoga and Rockport Township. The early years meetings were held on Sunday afternoons in homes of would-be parishioners and those who ultimately helped to build a church. So, 1875 for the founding, 1879, frame church consecrated with additions and changes made over time. And I know Greg has a bit on Mary a bit later, but we see Mrs. Mary Scranton Bradford, who was perhaps the biggest benefactress as she donated the present church site and encouraged the congregation to raise $1,500 and gave what was lacking to ultimately complete the church edifice. Reverend Burton helped to set up the initial church. His daughter Eliza would meet and marry Reverend Arthur Mann Backus, who was rector for the church. And in 1881, 1882, Reverend Lewis N. Burton, son of the Apostle of the West Side, became rector. He had an eye towards, and this is very, of course, prescient in his mind, eye towards both the congregation and Rockport Township growing rapidly over the next few decades with a new bridge over the Cuyahoga just being completed. So, of course, he was spot on in this prediction. This population would really boom over the next few decades. And we see kind of the situation here of the chapel and rectory in 1898 as the congregation grew. So we see chapel altar there. Congregation's growth meant that more space and a new church ultimately would be needed in the early 20th century. And plans to build a new church had started in the first 2 decades, but like many things, of course, were delayed with the breakout of World War I, of the Great War. By mid to late 1918, though, the church was ready to be consecrated, and the Lakewood Press covered the dedication ceremony for the church, detailing it, bear with me here for a couple of sentences, in the fall of 1918, again, just before the close of the World War. Quote, "The bishop will advance to the door of the new church edifice and striking upon it with his pastoral staff. He will demand admittance. The vestry of the church, headed by senior and junior wardens, will thereupon open the doors in response to the bishop's knock. The bishop, followed by the rector of the parish with the wardens, vestry and choir, will proceed up the center aisle. Arriving at the steps, the vestry will await the bishop's instructions, and the ceremony will be followed by the services of the benediction, after which Holy Communion will be celebrated." So that was the official opening of the church in 1918. George Christford was the architect of the church. Of course, physical structure here now 107 years old, so of course quite up there as well. And the J.W. Christford Company did many others in Lakewood, if the name's familiar, and you see some other similar buildings, such as Masonic Temple, Garfield School, amongst others. So the congregation expanded throughout the 20th century, while including many highlights, of course, over the century. Margaret Manor Butler, of course, the founder of the Historical Society, one of the chief chroniclers of Lakewood history, noted one of the staple events each year being the Strawberry Festival, where a circus tent was put up on the lawn prior to a full course dinner for the entire community, and of course the highlight being the strawberry crop from the year with cream on top. See a wonderful depiction here. Of course, many charitable works done over the decades. We see a sewing bee here highlighted from 1918. Amongst other events, and we found we had in our archive a nice chronology of kind of key moments that were marked by the church over these first decades in the 20th century. One of the highlights that really stood out to me that was drawn was a visit during World War II from Reverend Michael Coleman of All Hallows by the Tower Church in London, obviously right next to the Tower of London. This was in 1942. The church had been badly damaged in the London bombings, held an incredible history. The parish chronology from here proudly noted that All Hallows by the Tower was the church where the nation's 6th president, John Quincy Adams, was married to First Lady Louisa Catherine Adams. And I've got this photo because I visited there many times while working on my dissertation on John Quincy Adams. So this was a nice touch and really stood out to me in finding that. finding that connection here. At that moment, though, this was a time in which the church Ascension was actively sending aid to war prisoners, raising funds for the English church mission. And of course, like everyone else in World War II, playing its part here, the church was only heated on Mondays and Saturdays to ration coal during the war. So some tough times there. For just a couple of other notes in the 20th century on Ascension, 1951 saw 82 children attending Sunday school. 1949 counted 8 regular teams in the Ascension Bowling League, so very popular then. The softball team was a champion of Lakewood's Church League, which I'm sure was a pretty fierce competition then. 1957 article was quoted as saying, in recent years, the entire front of the church has been rebuilt. Many repairs and improvements have been made to the undercroft of the church and parish house, and a large, attractive hall was constructed over the gymnasium. There are also 2 other moments here that I want to highlight because, of course, we're in the 150th anniversary for Ascension here, but both the 50th and 100th anniversaries were celebrated, and we do have some information and some materials from those 2 moments too. So, of course, the 50th anniversary, 1925, and then centennial year really was stretched out. It started in early 74 and continued into 75. So the 50th anniversary article by the Suburban News and Herald marked Reverend George F. Williams as leading the charge of the growth. The article noted, of course, in that time, very dramatic change around in terms of the scenery, where there were, quote, almost no houses between Detroit Avenue and the lake, with the exception of some old residences. Now numerous new streets have been cut, and almost all available space has been built on. So that was the 50th anniversary. The article further noted that the number of communicants had nearly tripled, church budget had quadrupled, and a parish house and rectory, again, were growing. And the article closed, and I found this interesting, again, from 1925, that Lakewood was, quote, a city of homes with few apartments and no courts. And they said very strong emphasis on no courts, which were, quote, always a detriment to a community. So, courts out here. And it marked Lakewood, though, and I think this really resonates for a lot of people here, quote, as quote, one of the ideal cities for family life, and we hope that those conditions may continue. So I think they were spot on for that one. For the centennial celebrations that kicked off in 74, there was a rededication that was presided over by the Bishop of Ohio, Right Reverend John Burt. And that year highlighted, we have the list of events for that year. Speakers, Lenten speakers from the church's house. Hot mic. Ascension reunion and outdoor festival with summer speakers lined up. And then an article noted that the congregation was around 300 strong at that point. Now, in terms of some of the families for Lakewood, both the families, I'll add probably several caveats here, both for the families and some of the other religious institutions is in no way is meant to be exhaustive. These are just a few highlights here and there. Certainly, I think we'll have some space in the Q&A. I know we have folks both from the congregation here and many from Lakewood. Would love to hear some of your experiences after the fact as well. But for Ascension, I think the thing that Greg told me even before I started here, all roads lead to Ascension. That's what Greg says. All roads lead to Ascension. So, and it's true. If you look at some of the names throughout, everything comes back here. There's always a thread back to the church. So, again, a sampling of some of the families here. I'm just going to cover 4 or 5 here as we get started, and of course, many others have helped over decades and 150 years here. But perhaps the most obvious connection to the historical society is the Nicholson family. Family patriarch James Nicholson died in 1859 before Church of the Ascension was formed. He was, however, one of those very first settlers in Rockport Township, coming from Massachusetts in 1804 at the age of 21. After a harrowing journey, became the first permanent settler this side of the Cuyahoga, fighting in the War of 1812 while leaving his family, his wife and children behind, and killing a bear upon his return. We just moved from Massachusetts about a year and a half ago. No bears were killed in that process. A lot easier for us than James. and of course ultimately built the oldest wood frame structure here in Lakewood, the Nicholson House, still standing, dating to 1835. So we see his son, Ezra here. Ezra, his wife Alice, were key figures in the church from the start. Ezra, of course, inherited the Nicholson House from his father in grounds, prominent person, of course, about town. The couple would host prayer gatherings in the Nicholson House before a physical structure was built, and helped donate money for the 1875 construction. There are 3 children, very recognizable names for this part of town, as you might know. And Clarence, Grace, and Lewis also played a role in early church history. Lewis played, of course, violin. Clarence's children were baptized at the church, and Grace was in the altar guild, taught Sunday school, and was married by Ascension's minister. Alice Nicholson, their mother, helped, again, raise money for the rectory, was a member of the Ladies' Guild, and again, in addition to all of these things, hosted the Nicholson House over the decades, Ascension luncheons, card parties, dinners, exhibits, a very active connection there from the early days. Hotchkiss family also holds a strong connection both to the church and the historical society. We see Isabel Honum Hotchkiss, the daughter of John Honum, who was the one who constructed the oldest stone house, 1834, first occupant there. She inherited the house, was married to Orvis Hotchkiss, who we see here. We know that they were members of Church of the Ascension, and another shout out, thanks to Greg sleuthing here in the archives, these photos were really lost to history up until the last year. So we're thrilled that Greg was able to find these. These are items that we're able to show.
Bravo.
And we just opened for the season at the Oldest Stone House, so they're on display at the Oldest Stone House, looking to upgrade some of the framing, but you can see them there as well. So it's a really, really meaningful connection between, again, church and the society there. Couple of other families briefly here. Hurd family, Thomas Hurd, originally came from England, 1818, caretaker for a man named Richard Lord's estate, which was similar to many Lakewood plots today. It was a meager 320 acres, so you can't quite find those, but quite the estate there. He ultimately married Hope Randall Lord, Richard's daughter, received the estate. Thomas Hurd won the silver medal for the best wheat in Ohio in 1852. They were close to the Elliott family. Hope Hurd Browning, we see Hope Lord Hurd here. Recalled the 1890s, exploring Lakewood's gardens, swimming, croquet parties, and of course many of these descendants are still in the area today. And one other direct connection here, I'd like to mention the Elliott family parishioners. We see Henry Wood Elliott here, moved to Rockport Township with his wife Alexandra Milovadoff in 1873. He had spent a good deal of time in Alaska and met his Russian wife on the travels. They were married in a Russian church on St. Paul's Island. Of course, this was just after the moment that Alaska had been acquired by the United States in the so-called Seward's Folly of 1867, but she became quite the sensation in social circles upon moving to the area. Wood Elliott himself really carried on the tradition of naturalist here in what was in Rockport Township, kind of building on both his father, Franklin Reuben Elliott's legacy, and of course Jared Potter Kirtland. Ultimately became famous for the Hay-Elliott Treaty, which went into effect in 1912. John Hay passed away previously, but had done some of the legwork on it, and of course the Hay family, very strong connections here to Cleveland and Northeast Ohio, went into effect in 1912. It was one of the first pieces of legislation of animal protection in the world, aimed to protect and regulate fur seal trade. As a teaser for more on the Elliott family, for those of you who went to a lecture that we hosted a couple of weeks ago with the High School History Club, their co-president, Ava Wishusen, is giving a talk here, right, in a few weeks on the Elliott family. A few months, maybe.
A few months.
Coming up. Reference the printed material in a few months coming up. So more on the Elliott family to come. And I'd be remiss not to mention, as we're here, the Kunst family and the connection to Church of the Ascension, we're thrilled as a society that Father Vincent and the church have allowed us to host our annual meeting of the membership. Full announcement coming out soon, but that will be here at Ascension on April 30th. But we're really excited to have a keynote speaker, John Kunst, of the Kunst family, be able to share some of the family history here. So John Kunst is the great-grandson to Theodor Kunst, who was a figure of great renown in Lakewood and Cleveland in the 19th century. And ultimately, it was his company that did the pews and woodwork for the church here, of Church of the Ascension. So a really nice connection directly between the two of them. Now, want to situate again Ascension here for the last couple of sections here. Ascension within the religious history of Lakewood, and then just do a bit of a zoom out and look at Ascension within context of that moment of its founding in 1875 in the nation. Again, not exhaustive here, but just some connections here to other religious institutions that were coming up. Some preceded Ascension. Many of these churches no longer exist. Some do still exist in various forms. But of course, Ascension did not exist in a religious vacuum here in Rockport Township. Initially, not much tracked, and we're talking, again, 18-teens, early 1820s tracked in terms of religious proclivities from some of the first settlers here coming in. But once population started to increase, so too did formal religion and places of worship. Of course, many of these first religious groups that we're talking about in Rockport Township really followed some of these migration patterns coming from the East Coast, coming from upstate New York, out of the moment of the Second Great Awakening, which of course had a profound impact on the country, but especially upstate New York, dubbed the burned over district then for the revivalism of the period in the 1820s and 1830s. So there's a real cultural kind of migration and retention, especially here in Northeast Ohio, that really didn't track in the same way for many parts of Southern Ohio. Swedenborgians were perhaps the first organized religious group in Rockport Township, spearheaded by James Nicholson and Mars Wager. Nicholson was credited with drawing Wager back to the faith for the New Jerusalem Church, which had its building for over 82 years. Church was at the corner of Andrews and Detroit Avenues, constructed in 1848, ultimately had a new church, Church of the Redeemer, built in 1906. Baptists, of course, were also among the first to organize 1830s. Church started in 1832 with 9 members, up to 125 by the time that a meeting house was built in 1846. It was somewhat short-lived, that meeting house, down about a decade later. Spoken with a few folks here for next year anniversary for the Methodist forming a little bit later, so we're looking at 1876 there. And I think a highlight, too, of the Methodist forming, a lot of the different denominations really did get along quite well throughout the period. They were ultimately able to use the space from the Baptists, as I'll mention with a few of these other congregations, a lot of meetings in family homes, rented spaces, etc., before ultimately Methodists built their first structure in 1876, fully incorporating in 1896 as a Lakewood Methodist Church. Lakewood Disciples, aided by Cleveland's Franklin Circle, Disciples of Christ Church, established a Sunday school, created a chapel in 1878 on Detroit, just west of Park Row. Fire fortunately destroyed the chapel in 1895. And then another real wave of religious development prospered in the early 20th century with some new immigration patterns into Lakewood, with new physical structures being constructed in that period. Between 1897 and 1930, 25 different churches were founded, and again, a running theme for these congregations, regardless of when they were founded, is they began to meet and organize prior to having an actual physical structure. So they typically form organically in parishioners' houses, rented spaces, a lot of basements of buildings being used, and then, of course, fundraising appeals really would lead towards some of these churches being formed. Catholic churches really started to come into the fold in this period with immigration from Central Eastern Europe in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. St. Cyril and Methodius, 1903. Byzantine Rite St. Hedwig's in 1905 with St. Gregory's. See here. And 1908 for St. James's. So we see a 1935 depiction of a crowd entering St. James's there. Eastern Orthodox churches, of course, part of this time. St. Nicholas Ukrainian, 1916. Saints Peter and Paul, 1917. Of course, a lot of development in Birdtown neighborhood. And in addition to these, we see Presbyterian, Lutheran, congregational churches growing too in the early 20th century. Additionally, First Church of Christian Science and a Jewish Sunday school, but no official temple in Lakewood. Ultimately, by 1980, there were 40 churches in Lakewood, and while several congregations have ceased to exist over the years, many are still vibrant with churches and religious spaces throughout town. So again, just kind of a sampling here. I know many others over the years, but at least situating Ascension a little bit in terms of some of those religious developments in Lakewood. Now, I do want to finish somewhat personally, I guess, with that connection to when the church was founded in 1875. I think it coincides on a couple of different fronts here. So Ascension was founded almost exactly 100 years after the real start of the American Revolution, as it were. So a lot of those events are being commemorated just in the next couple of days and weeks, honestly, for the 250th anniversary of the country. As many of you know, I worked at the Paul Revere House before I came here, so we're just a few weeks off of the 250th anniversary of Paul Revere's Midnight Ride on April 18th, 1775, 18th into the 19th. So Ascension being founded 100 years exactly after this, almost exactly to the week, 100 years after the Battle of Bunker Hill in June of 1775, the first battle, of course, first major battle between American forces and British forces. So we have a lot of, again, those cultural attention moments from New England to the area here. But I think more importantly for that 1875 moment, Ascension came to be just as the nation was looking back upon its 100th anniversary. So thinking about the founding of the country, coming out of the Civil War, where the nation was going. And it was happening right at that time of that centennial celebration, both the planning in early stages in 1875, and then the actual centennial exhibit in 1876. I'm sure several in the room remember the bicentennial celebrations in 1976. It was a major, major deal for the country in 1875 and 76. So we see kind of a panorama. This was the first World's Fair to be held in the United States in Philadelphia. So celebrating, again, the nation's founding. I do liken this this kind of diorama of major events in American history. Top right there, we do have the Battle of Lake Erie on there, so represented very prominently. So that's great. The exhibition also highlighted some moments, some new inventions of the time. Alexander Graham Bell's telephone, the Remington 1 typewriter, and Heinz ketchup were highlights there. At the same time, that exhibition really began to shift public perception of the Civil War, a lot of ways towards reincorporating the South, kind of that lost cause mentality positioned the South more heroically at the moment, really set the stage for the election of 1876, in which we see Samuel Tilden there, ultimately lost the presidency to Ohioan Rutherford B. Hayes here, with a lot of the votes being shifted for the South to have more of its own say in home rule, really rolling back a lot of the work that the federal government had done, especially for the advancement of emancipated former enslaved persons. So we see Hayes there as part of kind of that succession of Ohio presidents, Ulysses S. Grant, president at the moment of Ascension, Hayes, and then, of course, for Northeast Ohio, James A. Garfield in 1880. In 1875, the United States also passed Civil Rights Act, legislation, of course, 150 years old, but quite important in today's day and age, we might say. The year also witnessed the first Kentucky Derby, first game of college football, and this was, I thought, one of the craziest bits that I found, the introduction of a 20-cent piece. So there officially was a 20-cent piece for about 2 years in the country. As you can imagine, it did not take off. A lot of confusion, but if you're a coin collector, these are apparently very, very hot ticket items. So 20-cent piece that we no longer have. But through all this turmoil, Church of Ascension sprouted, grew roots, and of course blossomed into the stable institution that it is today. So, again, it remains an important worship space in Lakewood, and I think really stands as that visible marker on Detroit Avenue here of stability with, unfortunately, a lot of history lost. A lot of those touchstones of the late 19th, early 20th century are gone. The major houses, the green space, even a lot of the rail lines and streetcar lines are lost, but we have Ascension here as a marker of that legacy. Not only offers religious services in a space where all are welcome, but I think embraces really the Lakewood community through various events throughout the year and so many great things that I know many of you have participated in. Of course, the car show as the Historical Society, we were so honored to have Ascension as part of the house tour last year. Father Vincent and Roger opening up the rectory for everyone to see and the church itself. Really a nice connection. So on behalf of the Historical Society, I'd like to officially congratulate the church on its 150 years, and hopefully we have a great lecture in 2175 for the next 150 years. It'll be around for 300th anniversary. So thank you all for having me.
You could hear me without the microphone. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Greg Zent, and I wear many hats here in Lakewood. I used to be part of the Historical Society, and I think that's on hold. I hope I'm invited back one day. I used to be an officer, and I was on the board for many, many years. I am a German teacher at Lakewood High School. And you might think, why do people take German? My answer is usually, you just need to get to know me. I have been coming to Church of the Ascension since I was born. I was baptized here at Church of the Ascension the year that it turned 100. You do the math. It's a milestone for me too. But the church did not look like that when I started coming here. But some of my relatives did know what that looked like. You can see the horse barn in the background. My family has been coming here since 1916, and my children are now the 6th generation to be gracing Church of the Ascension. So what I was hoping to do tonight is talk about some of what I consider the colorful people of our past. Some of them overlap what he shared, so I will move on quickly. If I talk too much, I want someone to yell at me and say, move on. I am notorious here at Church of the Ascension for every Sunday highlighting someone from our church's past. It might be someone that donated a considerable amount of money for a beautiful stained glass window, or something like the pulpit, or an altar. It might be someone that dedicated their time and energy to the church as a Sunday school teacher or on altar guild. So I try to highlight everyone that I feel made a difference. So we already mentioned Mary Scranton Bradford. When I first saw her name in our church's history, she was written as Mary S. Bradford. It didn't mention that her maiden name was Scranton, as in her family owned most of what we now look at Cuyahoga River as the West Bank and Scranton Road. That is her family. She was the one and only surviving child of Joel and, I gotta look. That's horrible, I forgot her mother's name. Irene Scranton. She was the only surviving daughter. Her mother died in 1858, and 3 weeks later her father died. Wow. And she inherited quite a bit of land, but not the ability to sign any legal documents for all that she owned. So 3 weeks after her father died, she married. And as a married woman, she was then allowed to control the land that she inherited from her family. was a little different back then. She donated the land. She was very passionate about the Episcopal Church. She donated the land that we are on right now. She donated money to help out the church build in 1875. She was notorious for finding young men that wanted to become ministers, and she would financially turn their hearts towards the Episcopal Church. She later was she was married for not a very long time. We saw portraits of her husband. He was very good looking. They did have a child that died young, and she adopted a niece of hers and raised her as her daughter. If ever you're interested in seeing the home of her adopted daughter and husband, it is in Galion, Ohio. We went on a field trip as a congregation and plan to possibly do it again. We were invited to go back this fall. So if that sounds like something interesting, please let us know. Ezra Nicholson and family. I say that we got a very good idea of all of his children, his wife being part of this and so forth. His brother, the other Lewis, is rarely mentioned, but not his son Lewis, but his brother Lewis and his wife also were part of Ascension. And I love that you mentioned that his father, James Nicholson, shot a bear, which he did. But his mother, Betsy Nicholson, shot a hawk. She took the musket from her husband that was never used in the War of 1812, but she shot a hawk because it was stealing her chickens. And it knocked her on her keister, the kickback from the musket, but she hunted down that dead hawk so she could show neighbors. Look what I did. So I think that the Nicholson family coming here as pioneers, and then Ezra Nicholson and his wife Alice, college-educated Ezra Nicholson, and then his children, Grace, Clarence, and Lewis, who were world travelers and in society pages and so forth. It's a huge difference in just two generations here in Rockport / Lakewood, Ohio. Huge changes. I love when I see the tents at the Nicholson house for the sale on the grounds, because in my mind I remember reading about the huge tents for the 250 guests at Grace Nicholson's wedding in 1909. And I think things have changed, but they haven't changed at all. Of course, the Nicholson House, we know that is a huge symbol for the Lakewood Historical Society, which I'm going to very quickly mention, that the Honan Hotchkiss House, known as the Oldest Stone House Museum, also part of Ascension's history and Lakewood Historical Society. But there's a third building. God, I need some water. Can someone give me a glass of water?
I got it.
By the way, the Oldest Stone House, where I have been going through all kinds of amazing things connected to Church of Ascension's history. The church here is going to be doing an exhibit, and some of the things are going to be on display thanks to the Lakewood Historical Society, including some of the names like some of the names that were mentioned earlier today. I'll throw it out when we get there. But so 2 buildings so far from the Lakewood Historical Society connected to Ascension. The third building, a 1959, I believe, medical building, where it's known to us now in Lakewood as the Haver Family Center. How could that be connected to Ascension? What? That was not always a 1959 medical building. The Zengerle and Norton family, two Lakewood families, 2 Ascension families. The Blanche, lower left, Blanche Norton, as in the Norton Toyer Meatpacking Company. Toyer is a name that some of us have heard of because they were just visiting. Blanche Norton grew up in this church, and as a little girl did all kinds of theater stuff. As fundraisers, she and her gang of girls would do all kinds of fundraising, really interesting stuff. She married the guy down the street, Joseph Zengerle, who was the Cuyahoga County auditor. And his home, by the way, that's their daughter, Hildegard, who just passed away a couple years ago, 103. An Ascension wedding. But their home, this is, if you squint really hard and look at the Haver Center building, This is what was there. And this is the type of house up and down Detroit. We had homes up and down Detroit that probably would rival what was on Lake Avenue or Clifton, and one by one, they left. Knocked down. To the right of that is I call it the other Hackenberg house. We always talk about the Hackenberg house on Grace, the large Grace home. That was his ex-wife. Mr. Hackenberg then had a beautiful estate right there, which now we enjoy Corky's. My family, we live close enough we can hear Corky-okie nights. But this was the Zengerle home, no longer. Jared Potter Kirtland, that's a name we should know when we go to Get-Go. At the corner of Bunce and Detroit, that is where the home of Jared Potter Kirtland, as in Kirtland Hills, as in Kirtland Lane, internationally known. His home was destroyed for Kroger's back in the 1950s. But he was part of Ascension. He paid for, helped pledge money towards the original chapel. His daughter was one of the few women on the list. She pledged independently towards the chapel. His grandchildren and great-grandchildren were also found in our records as parishioners here. His, I didn't know this until recently. I was going through obituaries, which is only something someone like I would enjoy. And I found his obituary, and it mentioned the funeral was not at Ascension. It was in his home, which was traditional. But the minister who did it was an Ascension minister. So funerals were usually at home, I believe, right? Alexander Whitten. How many of you know of Whitten Place here in Lakewood? The Whitten Place was at one time the Whitten home. And there is one of those historic signs out in front. But Alexander Whitten and his family, his children, some of their weddings were here at Church of the Ascension. If you don't know about Alexander Whitten, he was from Scotland. He originally had the Whitten Bicycle Company, later the Whitten Motor Carriage Company in 1897. One of his chief engineers recommended Henry Ford as someone to work for the Whitten Company. Whitten was not impressed and sent Henry Ford on his way, and Henry Ford, about 4 years later, had built his own motor vehicle and challenged Whitten to a race. I bet you can guess who won. Whitten did not win. But I heard through the grapevine that Alexander Whitten's son, Alexander Whitten Jr., was married here at Ascension, and the limousine that brought him to the wedding was a Whitten vehicle. And that may or may not be owned by someone in the Cleveland area and may or may not be part of our car show in the future. We'll have to see if that happens. The Rauch family, those of you that are into old cars, you may have heard of the Rauch and Lang electric automobile. It was at one time a carriage and sleigh company, and then with the motorized vehicle, they made motorized vehicles, but also electric automobiles, which electric automobiles at the time were considered perfect for women, because women might not be able to handle the power of a motor. They should not have said that to someone in my family. I think the women would have run them over with a motorized vehicle. One person I love to talk about, I absolutely love her story, is Virginia French Andrews. You might recognize her first, or maiden name, or last name, married name. Virginia French Andrews was actually born in Wisconsin. How did she end up in Lakewood, Ohio? Rockport, Ohio. Her mother died when she was an infant, and a relative, an aunt, came and visited and decided she and her husband, the French family, Rosetta and Collins French, were unable to have children. So when they visited relatives in Wisconsin, they brought little baby Virginia, known as Jenny, back to Ohio. They lived on the French farm, and during the Civil War, she wrote to a man by the name of Edwin Andrews, possibly a cousin, but back then I think that was acceptable. They ended up marrying and falling in love and marrying, yes. Shh, don't make that face. Edwin Andrews, during the Civil War, he was a soldier during the Civil War. They realized that he had a heart defect, and he was discharged. He did not have a long life. He died in the 1880s. And here's this woman, Virginia French Andrews, with the huge Andrews, which really was French, family farm, with 4 young men and an elderly father, all part of Church of the Ascension. She and her father and these 4 young boys took care of that farm. They raised fruit. They were given a lot of advice by Jared Potter Kirtland on raising fruit and using it as a fruit farm and so forth. The farm stayed in the family for many generations. It was, if you can imagine where the Masonic Temple is here in Lakewood, right next to it is a little strip of stores. That is where their large Victorian home was until it was torn down to make room for stores along the Detroit. The next one, it does make me sad, the changes. I wish I could go back in time and meet these people and interview them, but that's not possible. Hope and Grace, I know he mentioned them. First of all, how cool is that their names were Hope and Grace? I kind of joked during the service when I talked about these two. I didn't say it during the service because I probably would have gotten yanked off the podium. But I said to someone else, I was like, between Grace and Hope, I think it could have been a drinking game during the service. But Hope and Grace, both of them having parents that donated money towards Church of the Ascension, both of them being married here through Church of the Ascension, and they were good friends. When I look through society pages and they describe all the different activities these 2 women did, it was amazing. And I realized they had the time and energy because they were, at their time period, they were basically, because of their gender, they were basically confined to using all that creative energy, all of that ability to things like church life. So we were blessed for that. Their children and grandchildren, I've hunted them both down on both of their sides. Amazing, well-accomplished, brilliant people who have really given a lot of information about both families, the Hurd and the Nicholson family. The West family, that's a name that is very common in this church. We had 3 different West families all at the same time. When I found these images of Mr. and Mrs. West, it did not really occur to me who they were until I started looking through census records, maybe a year after finding these daguerreotypes. John M. West and Frances Nicholson West, no relation to the Nicholson family of Rockport. But they lived in Rockport on 700 acres. Their 700-acre farm, they they put aside 25 acres as their front yard in front of their home, which is still standing. Their 25 acres of front yard were used to create a man-made pond and a bridge and have exotic plants. And people from Ascension and from the area would go to their home and they would not refer to it as the West Farm. It was a farm, but they said it's so beautiful. It's like a park. We'll call it the West Park. Which if you're from this area, you can put it together that West Park was not their entire farm, but West Park got its name because of these people's farm. Their daughter, we don't have a picture of the son-in-law, but their daughter, Fanny West Southern, and that was her name, West Southern. I can't imagine going to the West Southern wedding, but Fanny West Southern was married to C.C. Southern, who was named Christopher Columbus Southern. Not Christopher Columbus, but Fanny West Southern must have been a mover and a shaker in this school, in this church. The first image that Robert showed us was of a painted image of this church. Yes, from 1898, and it was a little booklet that was made, hand painted by the women of the church, and it was to thank Fanny West Southern for all the work that she did back in the 1800s to make the first rectory, which was built in 1898, possible. She is remembered by many different churches, I am hoping, because her huge amount of land, she wanted it to go to good causes. She did not want it to just be developed into housing. She lived at the corner of West Clifton or originally Clifton West, and Detroit. Her home and parcel of land were sold in order to build St. Peter's Church, which is also Episcopal, right at the corner of West Clifton and Detroit. Across the street, that was also her land where Lakewood Congregational Church is now. Her son, her only biological son, Clifton West Southern, is one of our first records in our burial records. At the age of 3, he passed away. This is his image. This is one of 3 images that we have now at our church. He passed away at the age of 3, and his parents, very heartbroken, wanted his name to be remembered. And when they were developing parts of their land, they thought, let's have the street Clifton named after him. I said to someone, I'm not going to obsess about the streets because that's been done before, but I'm totally mentioning some of the street names and these people. But Clifton West Southern. So when you're driving on Clifton, remember Clifton West Southern. Harriet and George Marshall, I think they're fascinating. They were from New York. On their honeymoon, he took her on canal boat rides and carriage rides all the way to the big city of Cleveland from New York, where there was a whole big city waiting for them of 3,000 people. They couldn't believe what they saw when they came to Cleveland, and she wanted to stay here. She didn't want to just visit Cleveland. This became their new home. And it wasn't until they decided to retire, they moved to Little Rockport, Ohio, where they bought a section of land. Their home, which some of you might recognize, is on Ridgewood. It is from the 1870s. It was originally on Detroit, and she passed away in 1900. He passed away in 1904. They moved the house. Their children had the house moved from Detroit onto Ridgewood, just south of Detroit, near Peppers, if you go there, so that it was not on a major road, but on this tiny lane that they started as Ridgewood. And then they sectioned off the family farm and sold it. The Hall family. That might be a name you recognize. It's not, it is a street, but I'm not going to obsess about the streets. But their mother's maiden name was Curtis, Sarah Curtis. I think she was very proud of her last name, because from left to right, you have John Curtis Hall. In the middle, you have Curtis Hall, and to the right you have Matthew Curtis Hall. So when you find pictures at the Historical Society, it can be a little bit confusing when you see all this with Curtis. They married the 3 wives that they had. Actually, a couple of them had 2 wives. Some of them may or may not have had the maiden name Hall or Curtis. So it gets a little confusing also. But John, one wife, her maiden name was Hall. One maiden name was Patchen. That's how I say it. As a German teacher, it's probably Patchen, right? Patchen. Which you might look at that and say, I have no idea what that means. But if you've ever been to the Pink Hotel, there's a place called Silverhorn. Am I correct? Silverthorn. I'm sorry. Silverthorn. And Silverthorn was the name of that establishment back in the 1800s. And the Patchen family actually purchased it, and for a while it was known as Patchen House. And then it later evolved and so forth. But that was Emma Patchen. And then the Mayo family, that's also a street. But yes. All of these men, very, very influential here at Church of the Ascension, donating money for the original chapel. Their wives were super, super hardworking as far as fundraising and so forth. They're on like almost every document that I found and in the society pages for all the different things. Oviatt family. I grew up on Dover Center Road in Westlake, Ohio. Dover Center Road used to go through Dover, Ohio, which was Westlake and Bay Village, basically. And Dover Center being right in the middle. Makes sense, right? If you drive on Dover Center Road through Bay Village, you'll see Oviatt, West Oviatt, and East Oviatt. Very creative with the street names. And the Oviatt family, for years, for generations, had a lumber yard in that area, in Bay Village. And they were known for using their wood to create wooden baskets, which were used especially in Rockport, Ohio, because at the time in the 1800s, things like orchards and vineyards were typical, and they needed those wooden baskets. Dudley and Elmira Oviatt, when they got to a certain age, decided their son could take over the lumber yard. The address that was used for their house is long gone, but the address that was used for their home is the same address that is now being used by Lakewood Garden Center. That is how close their home was to Church of the Ascension. Because of that, Dudley Oviatt was very, very close to this church, physically but also spiritually. He was the man on vestry, which if you're not sure what vestry is, it's basically the governing group for an Episcopal church. They have the voting rights and so forth. He was the one and only senior warden, junior warden, treasurer, and clerk. So, and literally, when I went down, can you tell I teach teenagers? Literally. But when I went down to Trinity Cathedral downtown in the diocese, in their archives, it had Dudley Oviatt listed as all 4 officer positions. I thought that's actually kind of funny. The Elwell brothers, it looks seriously like a tough crowd. 2 of these men, they were all brothers, but 2 of these men, he was known as J.J. Elwell, or General John J. Elwell, who was a general during the Civil War. May or may not have had a special relationship with Clara Barton. I wasn't there. I don't know. Historians know. They don't want to say. And his brother Alfred, he went by Al, just call me Al, right? Al and his brother J.J. Elwell lived somewhere between this church and Garfield. That is how close their house was. Both of them donated money towards this church. They both outlived their children and wives, but they had nieces and nephews that moved to the Rockport area in order to be raised by these 2 men. And they were married and so forth, part of the Ascension community. Alexandra, she is honestly one of my favorites. I don't even have a picture of her husband. If you want to know about her husband, he is very famous. There are books about him. There are Wikipedia pages about him. There is a lot of information about Henry Wood Elliott. 20-some paintings that he did of wildlife from Alaska were just donated to the Cleveland Museum of Natural History by their great-grandchildren. Alexandra is like a footnote. That is it. And I find her fascinating. She came to Rockport, Ohio, where there were more horses than people, speaking Russian as her first language, teaching him Russian, and he was teaching her English. She was a teenage bride. He was 30. Today's world, that would not happen. But she came here, a very petite, exotic woman with long black hair and piercing eyes. Between the 2 of them, they produced 10 children. All 10 lived to adulthood. All 10 were part of Church of the Ascension. She became, he would come and visit while he was doing work at the Smithsonian or in Alaska. He would visit and then leave her for another year or year and a half. And then come back and say, nice to meet the baby. And then produce another one. This went on for many years, obviously. They had a long marriage. It was not exactly happy. They did not stay. After children were out of the house, she moved actually in with her eldest daughter on the West Coast, and he moved elsewhere. But her life story, coming here, having 10 children, not really having the support of a community, not knowing anyone, she became part of a community instantly by being part of Ascension. She became part of a clique of women that were the who's who of Rockport society. All of a sudden, she had the support of a community. I find it fascinating. Her daughter, named Flora Elliott, was married here at Ascension in 1900, and her wedding dress will be part of our exhibit. I actually was in contact with the great-grandchildren, and the 2 great-grandchildren said, oh, my mother donated the shoes. And the other one on the group chat said, oh, my mom donated the dress. Find it. And I did. So these are only 8 of the the 10 children that they had. Did I count that correctly? Yes, 8. 8 of the 10 that they had. Their stories I find also interesting. I find it all interesting. Reverend Lewis Burton, the apostle of the West Side. What to say about him? What did I write down? What to me is interesting, because you can read about him. If you're not in the Episcopal faith, he might not be that interesting to you. He worked at St. John's Church, which is in Ohio City, which for many years has been, people talk about, what is the oldest church? What is the oldest church in Cleveland? Is it the old stone church? Because it has old in it. No, it's actually St. John's in Ohio City on Church Street.
The oldest in the county.
Oldest in the county. But Reverend Lewis Burton was rector at St. John's. He didn't just come out to Rockport and say, you know what, we should start a church here. He and his daughter, Eliza Jennings Burton, named after her aunt, Eliza Jennings, who may or may not have donated her home and land for orphan children and elderly women, so that and then with time became what we know as Eliza Jennings. But Eliza Jennings Burton was dragged around by Reverend Lewis Burton. Her interviews with Margaret Manor Butler are kind of infamous, where she said, as an elderly woman, my father dragged me around and we would visit these people and he would stay too long. But Reverend Burton, he went up and down what was called the Plank Road and stopped at every single house. He visited the Coutant family. He visited the Hurd family. He visited the Beach family. He visited the Fry family. I'm not going to mention streets, though. I will not obsess about streets. But all of these different families he visited, he found out who was baptized, who was confirmed, what faith they were, what were their needs. If they didn't want religion, he was there anyway. He would help them do their laundry. He helped bury the dead. He would do anything they needed. He truly was a minister, ministering to the people. And because of that, people fell in love with him. And people wanted to be part of this movement he was starting. And I really believe he started the foundation upon which we stand. So, with that, I'm done. I do not want to obsess about the streets, but if you were a parishioner here in this church, you would know that every Sunday, this is our bulletin. It is not a book. I swear it's not a book. It's a bulletin. Every week we have a bulletin this big. And in it, every Sunday, there is a picture of a parishioner, as our minister eloquently says, and I always stumble saying it. It is a parishioner upon whose shoulders we stand. So we usually have an image of who that person is, someone from our church's history, and a page or two that I write about what their life was like and what their contribution was. Also, every month, I write for our Spires, which comes out, and I write an article. And 3 months in a row, I wrote about parishioners or somehow people connected to Church of Ascension's history, and they all have names that you would recognize as streets in Lakewood. And we made copies so that I can give them to each and every one of you if you have interest reading it. But it's a 3-part article, and it's entitled All Roads Lead to Ascension. And you will, if you live in Lakewood or you know Lakewood, you will look at these names and say, I recognize this. So, thank you.
Thank you all for coming. Please feel free to have a cookie or some more dessert or take a chicken leg. There's coffee still there. And we really appreciate you being part of our celebration. God bless you all.